Well, let's get started with our first topic, Deacon Matt. We are going to talk about DRE goal setting. That sounds fairly broad. What do we need to know about goal setting?
Well, we know that it takes a village to raise a child, right? That African truism is something that's true all around the world. It's true in the church too. And so that means when we goal set, we need to be thinking about a few things. We need to think about the goals that the diocese sets for us, like bishop guidelines or diocesan guidelines regarding catechesis for each grade level. If the pastor has particular catechetical objectives or goals, we got to try to meet those as well. And if we ourselves, as DREs, catechetical leaders, have our own goals we're setting, like a goal for the very beginning of the catechetical year might be just survive this first month. Maybe that's your goal. And hopefully you did make that goal, because if you didn't, you might not be alive. And we hope you stay alive and keep swimming upstream. So we think about those three different areas of goals. So let's talk about the first one, diocesan guidelines. So I'm sure you're aware of what your catechetical guidelines are from the diocese. Usually they're pretty specific and detailed about for each grade level, what are those different intellectual components that we want to have in place, the different concepts we want covered. It's very focused. Most of the time, guidelines are very focused on the intellectual objectives of catechesis. However, sometimes we see guidelines that include, they want to see like signs of moral formation. So how do we gauge that? What do we do as a DRE, or how do we help catechists to gauge, whether people are living virtuous lives and that sort of thing? And Steve's going to talk about that a bit when he talks about assessment instruments, things that will help us to evaluate our goals and whether we achieve them. Along that line of virtues, do you see signs of faith? Do you see not just understanding of concepts, what could just be pure memorization, regurgitation of ideas, and on up the Bloom's taxonomy to application and evaluation? But does that necessarily mean that the child, or if we're talking about adults and adult faith formation, does it mean that they have faith, that they believe the things that they're saying, and they believe the things that they're applying and evaluating, or are they just jumping through hoops? So these are things that are more intentional kind of assessments. These are things that you have to they're just more nuanced, but they're things that we can certainly look for, and Steve will talk about that in the next section. Also, with diocesan guidelines, I think the challenge for the DRE is, how do we help the catechist who's probably going to just follow the textbook, or if it's an online resource or whatever you're using, almost verbatim. It depends on the individual catechist whether there's going to be creativity there, pedagogical style and flair and savoir faire. There's this, they have a good working knowledge of the concept, so they get creative with it and really engage classes. And we know that's kind of hit or miss with catechists. It just depends on gifts. It depends on time, bandwidth, interest level, all of that. But keeping in mind, like, the primary thing is not just the intellectual piece of faith formation, and are we checking off the items that the diocese gives us for every grade level from an intellectual standpoint, but do we view also growth in faith observed by habits, behaviors, how people treat each other, whether they're there at mass, and also the things they say. And this is really important. I don't know if there's necessarily an official assessment tool for this, but you can gauge this throughout your year by asking children or whoever you're catechizing to reflect on their own journey of faith, either with you personally or with a peer or with the class, to have them articulate where they are in their journey, where God is, what their relationship with God is like, et cetera, et cetera. That to me is a proof positive that whatever you're doing is working, if they're able to articulate that faith journey in any pastor objective. Sometimes pastors get really involved, and that's great, but there again, it's kind of hit or miss. There is some level of catechetical training in seminaries, although I think most DREs and catechetical kind of professional people would agree we'd like to see more. So even though we have a 6th edition coming out of the program for priestly formation, I still don't think there's quite enough in there encouragement, kind of even requirement around not only becoming familiar with the catechism, but familiar with catechetical history, how the church is taught over the centuries, why it's taught the way it's taught in certain ways, and what it's emphasized and why, and what can we learn from that. So to really develop priests and deacons into teachers. But some pastors really do have that gift and that interest level. So if you have one of those pastors, that might be a blessing for you. You might find it as a curse, because maybe you collide with ideas and about how things should be, a clash of visions. But hopefully, your pastor who's setting who's getting involved is setting goals for you has a way to evaluate those goals for you. One of the worst things I've ever heard, and I've heard it multiple times at catechetical conferences, is that DREs either one, don't have job descriptions, or two, if they do have job descriptions, they're hardly ever evaluated on them, and probably not in a regular like not like with a regular frequency, I'm trying to say. All challenging when you're trying to meet the goals of your pastor. So if there's any takeaway from tonight about that, it's, if you haven't already, to dialogue with your pastor about, do you have expectations, and if so, what they are, and how will we evaluate those? And finally, what goals do you have as a DRE? And again, it could be, I'm trying to survive. It's my first year. I'm trying to figure this whole thing out, which, by the way, is a lifelong pursuit if you haven't figured it out. That's why it's called lifelong faith formation. I think I just said fourth formation, but I meant faith formation. Had a little bit of banana stuck on my tongue. At any rate, what were your personal goals? Why is that important? Or does it seem like just another superfluous level of detail? I'm telling you, it's super important. Why? Because it paints your own journey as a teacher, an administrator, but most importantly as a disciple. Because hopefully your goals for catechesis aren't just, I taught the diocesan standards, I kept my pastor's expectations, and I kept catechists going, or something like that, and I kept people moving through the religious education machine. No, it was, hopefully I grew, and this is how I grew. I was challenged, and this is how I met or didn't meet the challenge. And do I still feel called? What an opportunity when you're evaluating yourself to ask those really deep questions. Because again, your pastor might not ask those of you, your peers might not ask those of you. So it's up to you to do that kind of self-evaluation. So take advantage of that at any time along the year, but especially at the end of the year.